Hello and welcome to this session. I very particularly wanted to do this because I wanted to meet Paul. It's the first time we've met. Usually, if you do as many festivals as I do, and as Paul has done in the last year, you sort of you run up against people, don't you? But for some reason we haven't. And so I met him first through Prophet Song, and that has taken me back to previous novels because I think he's a very special writer. And if any of you have read Prophet Song, and I would really recommend going back and reading some of the previous four. Welcome. He's come all the way from Ireland today, this very morning from Dublin.
I'm here.
How was that for you?
Travel is exhausting, and you always discount the actual effort getting to, like London. You think it's 55 minutes away, but it's actually 5 hours from your door to where you're going to. But so I'm here. Right. I'm fine.
So first question I want to ask, which is a very small, tiny one, is how do you pronounce Eilish? Is it Eilish or Eilish?
You can say Eilish or Eilish. It depends on what part of Ireland you come from.
Because I mentioned that because I was interviewing Colm Tóibín a couple of weeks ago, and we had this discussion. Well, there you go. See, I said that wrong. Tóibín. Colm, I can get right.
Colm Tóibín.
Colm. I was interviewing Colm, and who also has Eilish. It's Eilish in his novel, and we had this conversation about which bit of Ireland, which pronunciation came from. So your pronunciation is in your head. How do you pronounce her name?
Well, I would pronounce her Eilish, but I made a fatal mistake. Thank you. When the audiobook was being recorded, and I was told to send through a pronunciation guideline for the actor Jerry O'Brien, and I said, "Oh, he'll know how to pronounce it." And then in the audiobook, it's Eilish.
Oh
so,
dear! Oh
yeah.
dear!
But it's fine. I mean, when you read a book, that book is your interpretation. So I've made my paper swan. I've placed it on the river, and it's gone downstream. So how you want to pronounce the names after that, how you want to interpret it, it's entirely yours as a reader.
So it will be Eilish. It will be Eilish from now on. How many of you have read Prophet Song? A lot. Brilliant. So for those of you who haven't, you probably have read about it, and you will know that it's a would you call it a dystopia? Do you own dystopia?
No, I don't. Sorry, we can get to that in a few minutes.
It is the story of, as has already been introduced, of a mother shepherding her children through a nightmarish society which has gone over to the bad, has become fascistic. So you probably don't. Do you agree with fascism as a descriptor of that society?
You can use the term. I don't mind that one.
You don't mind that one.
I have a problem with dystopian for reasons we'll
get
into.
Well, we'll talk about that. So it's a surveillance society, and I found there were moments in it. You've described it as a work of radical empathy, and I found the radical empathy for what it is to be somebody who is so alienated and so persecuted that they don't have that they're sort of driven beyond any sort of communal social identity. And I found that a couple of times when I was reading it that it made me cry, actually, because it made me cry for all the news stories I was reading about people who are in exactly this situation now in this country. I think it is the most extraordinary work of radical empathy. Talk about this.
I came up with the term one afternoon when I was having to answer some questions for the Booker. I was just doing a Q&A, and I just came up with the term. I just thought this will do, and now it's following me around, so I have to justify it. And the interesting thing is, it does seem to fit. I think that in some ways, when I was writing this book, I thought a lot about the world that this is depicting, which is a world where it's a world of societal collapse. It's a world of repression. It's a world where the known world becomes the unknown world, and a liberal democracy collapses. But the outcome is what we see on the news. And I've thought a lot about what I call the spectacle, about how we watch the news. We watch the news while we're eating our dinner. And I think about how, as a kid in the 80s in Donegal in Ireland, I watched the news, eating my dinner. It was a little corner TV, and the news was always on. And what you're getting on the news has become completely normal to you. But if my grandparents, when they were kids, could have seen that, they would have been astonished at what is the norm. And the norm are images of destruction and dispossession on a biblical scale every night on the news. And we just continue eating. And in many ways, we have to continue eating because it'd be very difficult, I think, to get out of bed. If you truly meet the reality of what the world is, I think that if you were to sort of decondition yourself to what the reality is, life would be difficult to live. But at the same time, that strikes me as problematic. And so we are inured to what we see. We've built up this resistance so we can get on with our day. And the thing about fiction is, well, fiction has this built-in ability to be empathetic for starters, because it can enter, fiction brings you to that moving light of consciousness that you cannot get in any other art form. It's very unique for that. Fiction can inhabit all the spaces that other art forms can't quite get into. It's quite remarkable for that. And so what I was thinking about when I was writing this book was how I could get past the spectacle, how I could get around it, how I could enter into the ordinary moments. The moments that are actually cannot be captured by journalism. The moments of there not being enough milk in the fridge. And that being the motif in the book. The moments of, a mother fighting with her teenagers in the kitchen, quibbling over nonsense. But that's where the beauty of life is actually. And so I designed the book in a certain way to have an immediacy that brings the reader into the space. It's written in the present tense. It's written in close third person. So you're always right up alongside Eilish. You always feel what she's feeling. You see what she's seeing. You're inhabiting her space. And so you start to become imprinted by her. And there are moments in this book that are what Virginia Woolf called moments of being, where we often have these in our own lives where suddenly your ego has sort of disappeared and you're just suddenly in the flow of life. You're suddenly you've transcended slightly, and then you come back to yourself and I see I was lost there, but actually you were in the flow. And so the book has these sentences that take you into that space with her. And so you're always alongside her. And so as that world starts to crumble and it takes you into the 9 circles of hell, because the book is 9 chapters, and I think it's fair to say, chapters 7, 8, and 9 are the deeper circles of hell. When you go there with her, and when you experience her losses, you experience them as though you are living them. Mm. Perhaps in a way that maybe a movie can't even do. Mm. And so I was thinking about that a lot when I was writing, about how fiction can locate the reader in a space that maybe, like, what I mean is that fiction used to hold the central space in the culture. There was a time when a writer like Saul Bellow could be number 1 on the bestseller charts in 1963-64 for like best part of a year in America, with a very philosophical, dense novel. And I'm fascinated by that because that could never happen now. And it's like something has been lost, that voice, that quiet whisper in the ear that novelists used to have. We're fighting hard because we're in a culture where the noise has never been greater and the competition has never been greater. And so I kept thinking about, how can I push fiction? How can I make fiction do what I want it to do to get that whisper in the ear back in a central place? And so the radical empathy thing, the label that I used, that approach was one of my approaches.
Mm. And it's compared often to Cormac McCarthy and Margaret Atwood, but there is this. It is the essential difference of it. It seems to me is that Eilish and the family are so normal. There are things like they're growing, their teeth are coming through, and there's just sort of the materiality which you don't get so much in either of those authors.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is part of the reason why I disavow the idea of it being a dystopian. I think it's a kitchen sink drama. It's a social realist story. It's actually got lots of layers. But the dystopian thing I found to be problematic because, well, for a start, anything that's actually happening in the world right now the novel ceases to be speculative if something is happening elsewhere. And so readers at some point start to realize that what they're reading in the novel is actually occurring elsewhere. So that at that point, it cannot be dystopian, it cannot be speculative. It ceases to be dystopian when it's not projecting into some strange idea of the future, but actually a very possible idea of the future, which is a Western democracy taking a turn towards tyranny or authoritarianism. That's not actually a dystopian idea. And it also ceases to be dystopian because of the idea of the conversation in this book. It's not directed at the future. The book is in conversation with the mythic past. It's in conversation with the present and with the future. It's in conversation about what occurs now, what has always occurred, and what will continue to occur. Because there's a mythic space in the book. And that, like, those ideas were really important to me. And so I think publishers love to latch on. They slap a label on it and like, this is dystopian. And that's fine. And if it sells more books, then that, I'm not going to quibble about that. But that's why I say it's not dystopian. And the social realism is a huge part of it. Because what this book is measuring, in many ways, what it's paying attention to, is the personal cost of events. How precious what we hold is. And when that's taken away, how easy it is for it to be taken away. And it's about measuring what we take for granted, what we're conditioned to take for granted. Because Eilish is somebody who's grown up in a liberal democracy in the West, and so she presumes that liberal democracy is always going to hold, because that's what you do. And then the book, piece by piece, dismantles that idea until, as I said, the known world ceases to exist. And Eilish's denial is a huge part of this story. She's in denial about what's occurring. Because at the start of the book, we have a situation where a populist government has been elected into power, but she's just getting on with her life. She's just going to work. She's trying to get her infant child to creche. She's got 3 teenagers who have to be brought to school. Meanwhile, there are curbs on the media. Social freedoms are beginning to slide. And then her husband, Larry, who's a trade unionist, is taken in for questioning. And he's a trade unionist. So that's a normal feature of the right to march, the right to protest. It's just a normal built-in feature of living in a liberal democracy. And the GNSB, who are the Garda National Services Bureau, who are Ireland's secret police in the book, because we don't actually have secret police, they put it to him. They say, well, can you prove to us that your intention to march for the Teachers' Union of Ireland is not an act of sedition against the state? How do you prove that if that's what you do, if you are a trade unionist? And so that's the point at which, the tipping point may have already occurred, but everyone's in denial because they're just caught up in their lives. And so I'm interested in that, in that sense of not recognizing the signs, not reading them. And then when they're placed before you, ignoring them because you presume that common sense will prevail. You presume that the rest of the world will step in and put manners on the government and say you cannot do this. You presume all the good things that have held will always hold. And that's a very dangerous presumption.
And you have this very interesting figure of her father who is slipping into dementia, but is a truth teller as well at the same time. So he's like a Sybil or something, isn't he? I mean, I can see that he could come from some sort of a mythical model.
He's kind of like a blind man an oracular blind man. And in some ways he is blind because he's sliding into dementia. He's her elderly father, but he's sliding into dementia in a way that the past for him is obviously disappearing, which is the known world, which is the world of liberal democracy. But he has these moments of lucidity, these moments of sort of just total self-awareness, of awareness of what's happening. And there's a point, because he was a scientist, and there's a moment in the book where he says to Eilish, he says, you've taken the degree, and he says, you understand what reality is. but you need to understand what they are doing now, as in those people in power. He says, tradition is only what we can all agree on. Once you take ownership of the institutions, you can start to change the facts. You can start to change the narratives. Once you say something is something else enough times, people start to believe it's true. And he said, that's what's happening now. And he tells her, he says, you need to leave. When you go to visit your sister in Canada at Easter, maybe you should consider staying there. And she says, but how can I do that? Because Molly is top of the league in hockey. Mark's doing his leaving cert. I'm, Larry, waiting for Larry to come out of detention, and also, you're an old man.
Leaving him.
Yeah, like what if you fall and break a hip? What then? But her sister in Canada, as things start to unravel, says to her, well, you need to get out. And she says, history is a silent record of those who did not know when to
get out. And I was wondering to what extent there's a lot of sort of the what we know about the history of the Second World War in this. Yeah,
well, I mean, we all do this when we watch the documentaries. We say, ha, I would have known when to leave. I would have got out. And the book asks the question, well, would you really? Because it's very hard to read the signs. It's very hard to read the signs when you're Eilish Stack, when you are working a busy career for a pharmaceuticals company, when you own a house in a city where you've always lived, when you've got teenagers at school, when you're in the complete complexity of your life. And you can't see all the signs, because we can't. This is the thing about what this book does as well. It doesn't place you into the center of the politics, because life for most people is not lived in the center of the politics. Life is lived in the ordinary moments. We don't see what's going on. We don't often understand what's going on. We get what we get from the news. And so this book is focused specifically on, it's foregrounding the ordinary life. And it's deliberately backgrounding the obvious stuff, the obvious mechanisms, the obvious politics. And because my attitude is that a lot of people say, well, what's the politics of the government? And it's like, it's irrelevant, because the outcome is always the same. The politics can come from an extremist left, it can come from extremist right. It's been interesting to observe how almost everybody assumes it's extremist right. But it could also be extremist left. There's no reason why it can't be. And but the outcome is the same. And it's the outcome that I'm interested in. And so I talk about this a lot, the idea of, when we read the Iliad, what we're getting is the politics and the great hero, the heroes foregrounded. But this book is turning that inside out. It's interested in burning Troy. It's interested in the small people in the background and what they have to deal with. Because that's actually how life is lived for most people. We are not at the heroic center of things.
But you say that it's dependent on having some sort of an oppressive government. But actually, what some people living in this country who are living without, who are in detention without trial, and who have no legal status, they are already living in this. So what we think of as a normal government, as a humane government, is actually not behaving humanely towards the people who are coming in and are clustered in detention camps around the coast.
This is why the book's not dystopian. And it's interesting to observe also how I've noticed, I took a lot of questions for a Q&A from Dutch readers, and all the questions from the Dutch readers were completely focused on their sense of how their country could go down the tubes. And they had absolutely no awareness of what the book was also speaking to. And so readers in Western Europe see this book as an allegory, as a prophetic allegory of what can happen to them. But if you're in the southern hemisphere, you're seeing the book as an alarm call to the present moment of what's happening somewhere else or in your country now. And because I've traveled a lot now, and I'm meeting readers from different countries, and they speak to me and they say, your book is speaking to where we're at right now. And so it's interesting to observe the difference between a reader in, say, in Ireland and a reader in India, or a reader, in many different countries.
Mm-hmm. I think we'd like you to read a little bit. Would you
Okay.
be happy to do that? Yes? Would you have a little bit? Yeah.
Well, you've no choice. It's always tricky to do a reading with a handheld microphone, but we'll get there. The night has come, and she has not heard the knocking, standing at the window looking out onto the garden. How the dark gathers without sound the cherry trees. It gathers the last of the leaves, and the leaves do not resist the dark, but accept the dark and whisper. Tired now, the day almost behind her, all that still has to be done before bed, and the children settled in the living room, this feeling of rest for a moment by the glass. Watching the darkening garden, and the wish to be at one with this darkness, to step outside and lie down with it, to lie with the fallen leaves and let the night pass over, to wake then with the dawn and rise renewed with the morning come. But the knocking. She hears it pass into thought, this sharp, insistent rapping, each knock possessed so fully of the knocker, she begins to frown. Then Bailey, too, is knocking on the glass door to the kitchen. He calls out to her, "Ma'am," pointing to the hallway without lifting his eyes from the screen. Eilish finds her body moving towards the hall with the baby in her arms. She opens the front door, and two men are standing before the porch glass, almost faceless in the dark. She turns on the porch light, and the men are known in an instant from how they are stood. The night cold air suspiring, it seems, as she slides open the patio door. The suburban quiet. The rain falling almost unspoken onto St. Lawrence Street, upon the black car parked in front of the house. How the men seem to carry the feeling of the night. She watches them from within her own protective feeling. The young man on the left is asking if her husband is home, and there is something in the way he looks at her, the remote yet scrutinizing eyes that make it seem as though he is trying to seize hold of something within her. In a blink she has sought up and down the street, seeing a lone walker with a dog under an umbrella, the willows nodding to the rain, the strubbings of a large TV screen in the Zajic's house across the street. She checks herself then, almost laughing, this universal reflex of guilt when the police call to your door. Ben begins to squirm in her arms, and the older plainclothes man to her right is watching the child. His face seems to soften, and so she addresses herself to him. She knows he too is a father. Such things are always known. That other fellow is much too young, too neat and hard-boned. She begins to speak, aware of a sudden falter in her voice. "He will be home soon, in an hour or so. Would you like me to give him a ring?" "No, that will not be necessary, Mrs. Stack. When he comes home, could you tell him to call us at his earliest convenience? This is my card." "Please, call me Eilish. Is it something I can help you with?" "No, I'm afraid not, Mrs. Stack. This is a matter for your husband." The older plainclothes man is smiling fully at the child, and she watches for a moment the wrinkles about the mouth. It is a face put out by solemnity, the wrong face for the job. "It is nothing to worry about, Mrs. Stack." "Why should I be worried, Garda?" "Yes, indeed, Mrs. Stack. We don't want to be taking up any more of your time, and aren't we damp enough this evening making calls? It'll be hard work getting ourselves dry by the heater in the car." She slides the patio door closed, holding the card in her hand, watching the two men return to the car, watching the car move up the street. It brakes for the junction and its tail lights intensify, taking the look of two eyes that gleam. She looks once more onto the street, returns to an evening's quiet. The heat from the hall as she steps inside and shuts the front door, and then she stands a moment examining the card and finds she has been holding her breath. This feeling now that something has come into the house. She wants to put the baby down. She wants to stand and think, seeing how it stood with the two men and came into the hallway of its own accord, something formless yet felt. She can sense it skulking alongside her as she steps through the living room past the children. Molly is holding the remote control over Bailey's head, his hands flapping in the air. He turns towards her with a pleading look. "Ma'am, tell her to put my show back on." Eilish closes the kitchen door and places the child in the rocker, begins to clear from the table her laptop and diary, but stops and closes her eyes. This feeling that came into the house has followed. She looks to her phone and picks it up, her hand hesitating. She sends Larry a message, finds herself again by the window, watching outside. The darkening garden, not to be wished upon now, for something of that darkness has come into the house.
Several things. I can't clap because it was rather appropriate that you had an intervention.
I thought that was really interesting. No one shouted at me to shut the fuck up in the middle of a reading before. Kind of enjoyed it.
We assume it was incidental. So a couple of things that come out of that. First of all, you've said that opening came to you very, very quickly and immediately.
Well, you can put it that way, but there was there was a long time before that when I couldn't get to that point. Well, I mean, it started maybe 3 years, possibly about 3 years before this. I was full of the feelings that are in this novel, but I didn't know how to write it. I had no sense of how to find the form for the story that I wanted to tell. And I had this opening sentence. This opening sentence I was really, really proud of. Not this opening sentence, but something completely different. And I went to New York for a month, and I would get up every day and I went to a cafe. And I had the opening sentence, and I would start from there and try and find a story. And after a month, I just thought, this is a disaster. I'm just like Jack Nicholson in The Shining. I'm going to park this. And then I wrote Beyond the Sea in that time instead, which took me 2 years. And as soon as Beyond the Sea was done, this sentence came back, whispering in my ear, you're not done with me yet. And so I started, and I found the shape of a story that quickly, early on, I thought, this is the wrong bloody novel. I'm writing the wrong bloody novel. But I persisted because, I think it's important to turn up every day if you're a writer. Turn up anyway, summon the muse, dance the muse, see what happens. And so I persisted for about 6 months. And it wasn't taking the shape that I look for. I'm fundamentally a storyteller. I have a lot of ideas. But to me, fundamentally, I'm looking for a vessel that is a story, that sets out to sea and moves like a story, but at the same time can carry as freight under the line all the ideas that I'm interested in. But the story must demonstrate the ideas. I'm not interested in telling the reader what the story is about. The story demonstrates its ideas. It's really important to me. And I think it's the hardest thing to do. It's really difficult to do that. But you can do it if you find the right story. And so I knew this wasn't the right story. And I remember it so distinctly. It was 3 o'clock on a Friday, and I'd been writing for 6 months. I just thought, I'm done. I'm completely done with this. And I'm going to, we mentioned Colm Tóibín. Colm Tóibín once said, finish everything you start. And I say, know when to stop. Put it in the drawer, leave it be. And I just shut it down, put it in a folder, and I hid it. But I had this sense something else was there, something else was lurking. And I came back on Monday, and I created a new document, and I waited. And I just looked at the blank screen, and then I wrote the first page of what you've just read. And I wrote it almost identical to how it is now. Maybe a few words different here and there, but largely it was there. And immediately it had what I looked for. It had the beginning of a story that I knew I could suddenly feel resonating inside me where this might go. But it also had that thing that language should have, which is that sort of ineffable substance, that sense of a deep voice, of something you cannot rationally arrange on the page. It's not something you sit down and cognitively put into the language. It's something that has to come from the subconscious. It has to come through the language. And that's the intuitive act. You know, what happens betwixt the pen and the page is always a mystery for a writer, because you're dealing with the subconscious. You're opening that door to the dark, and you're summoning through something that you have no direct control over. And yet that thing that you're summoning, very often you realize, is an intelligence. It's your intelligence, but it operates completely out of sight. It seems to be a lot smarter than you are most of the time. It seems to have a far deeper understanding of what life's about in the way that you do not during your day-to-day life, when you're just obsessed with what I need and what I want and what I should be doing. It's operating on a completely different level. And so all writers are summoning from this place language that can articulate these feelings, these intuitions, these ideas. And I knew as soon as I wrote it, I thought, there it is. That's what I've been waiting for. And the opening lines, those sentences, they say murder all your darlings, but what I did was I kept them. And then there was a moment in the book where I slipped them in. And so they're hiding in the novel.
They're hiding in the novel. I mean, that's such an interesting evocation of a writer's life, that you have to turn up to work every day,
Yeah.
but your muse doesn't necessarily turn up with you.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
you have to just go and wait.
yeah, and it's funny, you know, a lot of writers will wisely say you just turn up anyway, and I agree. And that some people say writer's block is nonsense, but actually writer's block is stress. We know this from, some of you may have read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which is an extraordinary book of cognitive psychology. And he talks about how there are different systems in the brain. But there's one system that's the intuitive system, the high-speed system. It's all intuition. But the other system is slow thinking. It's the mathematical side of your brain. It's the rational, cognitive, what's 365 multiplied by 82? You're like, That's the side you do not write from. But when you're stressed, that takes over. So I've observed this. You know, you're sitting there and you're rationalizing your way into the writing. Once I see that happening, I know I shouldn't be writing. The muse isn't going to turn up because the muse is roadblocked. There's a roadblock and there's burning tires, and the muse is just not going to get through on that day. So, you know, I'm a big believer. Nietzsche talked a lot about how walking was a great conduit to intuition. I'm a meditator. I take meditation very seriously, and I've been meditating for a very long time. And so walking and meditation are my ways of summoning the muse, of keeping that door open.
But you've also been a newspaper sub-editor, which is the absolute opposite. So how do you keep that sub-editor at bay when you're writing?
Well, the sub-editor is always with me, actually, because I realized after many years that the way I was writing was like a news shift, was like a sub-editor shift. Because I started working as a sub-editor for the Sunday Tribune, which was an Irish national newspaper. It's now gone, unfortunately, but it was rather like the Observer. It was a sort of centre-left, intelligent, broadsheet newspaper, and it collapsed in 2011. But I started working for that paper when I was 19, and I blagged my way in, and they gave me a shift a week. I had one shift on the news desk, and then it became 2 shifts. And then I dropped out of university, and I suddenly became a sub-editor, and I had a full-time job, and it just grew from there. And you know, my 10,000 hours, so to speak, was as a sub. If I have 10,000 hours, it was a sub. And it was incredible training because, you know, at the time I wouldn't allow any thought that I could be a novelist. I think that deep down I thought about it very seriously, but I wouldn't allow myself permission to be a novelist because I just thought there's too many bad books in the world. And I don't want to contribute to mediocrity, and I just don't want to do that. But also maybe I'm not good enough for that. So I didn't even write for years. I was just editing other people, and then I became the chief sub-editor on a section, and then I became the deputy chief sub-editor of the paper. And then one day, the books editor came over to me, and she said, "I think you need to write a review for me." And she said, "Here's a book," and it was called Reunion by Alan Lightman. And she said, "I want this next week, 400 words." And I had no choice, so I wrote the review, and apparently it worked because she came back and said that was a really marvelous review. You're going to do another one for me. And then the magazine editor came over one day and she said, "The film critic is away. Can you cover for him for one film?" And what was interesting was the film critic wouldn't let anyone cover for him while he was away. He would cover all the films in advance. So even while he was away, they were already pre-written But there was one crack, which was one film, which was called Shaun of the Dead.
That was Shaun of the Dead.
And so I reviewed Shaun of the Dead. And the thing is, I was a film nut at the time. I was a very serious cinephile and took cinema very seriously. So I wrote that review. And the next week, the film critic came up to me and he said, Paul, that was a really wonderful review. I'm going on holidays in a couple of months. I want you to cover for me. And nobody had ever been asked. And so I covered for him. And then I ended up replacing him when he retired. And so that's how I started writing.
So you're not only a sub-editor, but a critic. I mean, those are the two things that slay original fiction,
I know,
basically.
yeah. But, you know, I tell you, the training was great. Because, well, the training as a sub is marvelous because you learn what writing is actually all about. You learn clarity and compression and comprehension and all these, you know, these fundamental ideas. You learn what tone is. You learn how to shape writing. And so when I started writing my fiction at 30, I knew how to do it. And I discovered I had tone, I had voice. It was quite interesting. And so a lot of writers who write in their 20s and they go and they do a creative writing program when they're like maybe 23, they're going to spend the next 5 years or more learning all the things that I was learning anyway in journalism. And then when I was a film critic, well, I learned about narrative and I realized the importance of storytelling. Because, you know, the modernists sought to completely explode it, and the modernists for me are still probably number one. I adore Faulkner, I adore Woolf, I adore Joyce. But at the same time, we've come through an era where it seems that there's sort of a storytelling is a dirty word. And I reviewed over 1,000 films, so you're reviewing them critically, you're looking at how they're put together. And every film, no matter how fractured, no matter how atomized, is telling a story and is operating by laws. And I learned this, and I realized that the power of storytelling is such that it's fundamental to actually who we are. It's fundamental to how we narrate reality. It's fundamental to life because, you know, going back to Kahneman, Daniel Kahneman, and modern cognitive psychology, we know that reality is composed of billions of inputs, just billions of data around us all the time. And we're constantly narrating this reality, and we see A, and we see C, and we infer B. We're creating narratives of causality all the time. And the brain loves story. And so it seems to me that like the actual creation of a story, well, that's cheesecake to the brain. It's cheesecake to how our brain works. So this is why we love stories. Our brain devours them because it's actually what it's doing every day. And so I take story really seriously, and I consider myself a storyteller above all things. And when I'm thinking about what I need to, the novel that I have to write, and I say have to because I don't choose them. It's not a rational decision. It comes to me. But my first thing that I'm looking for is this a good story?
Mm-hmm. So the other thing that comes out of this reading is style. And when hearing it is a very different experience to reading it on the page, partly because of your choices about how to set it out. So, for example, it doesn't have paragraph breaks. It doesn't have speech marks. It doesn't play. You're not sort of allowing those sort of easy listening sort of things, which actually inevitably, when you read it out, and when the audiobook, I read the audiobook, it puts in those easy listening devices. So it's a completely different experience to read it on the page than to listen to it.
There are no quotation marks in reality. I like the idea of conveying a sense of the real as much as possible. And when you sit down to write a story, you're crafting a form. The form is the mesh that holds the story together. It's all the decisions that you make through language, through grammar, sentence length. This is the form. The form conveys the meaning. It should convey the meaning. So every decision that you make should be speaking to what the book is about. And it became clear to me that, well, this is a story where Ailey Stack is completely imprisoned in her reality, in what's unfolding. And what's unfolding has a sense of inevitability that cannot be reversed. It's a sense of implacability. And so there should not be room for the reader to just opt out with these paragraph breaks. You're in the text as Ailish is in her life, and you can't escape. And the long sentences as well are part of a way of conveying that sense of of being caught up in reality, of being caught up in something that's pulling you along as it's pulling the reader along. And I've never used quotation marks in any of my books. And there are actually many writers who don't use quotation marks.
It's the sort of thing that writers sit around in green rooms at festivals talking about, isn't it? It's the use of...
I think they're ugly for a start, but I also think they produce lazy writing.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of younger writers, if you just put quotation marks around it, then somebody just said it, without any consideration of how it sits to the ear, without any consideration to how much character is in that line. So, I mean, there are he says and she says whenever they need to be there to make it a bit easier for the reader. It's not hard to read, but I believe that in a dialogue, you should know who's speaking based on the feeling of that character. There should be something there that conveys who they are.
Earlier on, we mentioned Paul mentioned a novel, Beyond the Sea, which I've just read. It's the most recent one I've read, and that takes it to the opposite extreme. There's one page which just has storm on it, because you don't need to know anything more than there is another storm, because this is two men who are stuck at sea, and they go through storms and they go through calms. And then that page with that one word on, I just found it sort of really powerful. Completely took me by surprise.
Yeah, I mean, that's a book in which two men are cast adrift on a boat into the Pacific Ocean. And what happens is that they go to sea before a storm. Bolivar is told there's going to be a storm, but he decides he doesn't care. He's master of his own fate, he'll be fine. And he finds his fellow fisherman's gone missing, probably arrested the night before. So he finds a teenager called Bolivar who's come out in the boat, and Bolivar questions him and says, well, they just said there's going to be a storm. And Hector's the youngster, and Hector says, they just said there's going to be a storm, and Bolivar's like, it's fine, I'll pay you extra. And there's a storm, and they're washed out into the Pacific Ocean. They're washed out beyond the reach of the Coast Guard. And so they are effectively two men imprisoned on a boat, adrift, into the abyss, which is the Pacific. So it's kind of like Schrodinger's cat. They're dead and alive at the same time, in the sense that the chances of rescue are so infinitesimally small. They are dead, but yet they're alive. And so the book becomes this laboratory experiment of two men in an existential vacuum, where they are alive and they're trying to make sense of, well, not just what's happened to them, but actually who they are. And it's a book that I always wanted to write. I always wanted to write that sort of European philosophical novella, something very, very precise, something that's evoking these sort of ideas, but chasing something that I think is gone from fiction, because there's a conversation that's fallen silent, largely fallen silent in literature, and I think it really truly began with Melville's Bartleby. And it's the point at which fiction took on board the idea that there is no God. That for those of you who don't have faith, this idea that the universe is silent, that we are alienated on Earth. There is no God, and Bartleby became just overcome by what's called acedia, that sort of philosophical indifference. He can't be bothered to engage in anything. And you can see that conversation happening through fiction from that point on. It's in Dostoevsky, it's in Conrad, it's in Dostoevsky's Underground Man, it's in Conrad's Heart of Darkness in an extraordinary way. It's picked up all the way through many writers up until the sort of mid-20th century. The existentialist novelists dealt with it head on. And then Beckett drove it into the ground with his gnashing of teeth and wailing of absurd despair. And after that point, it sort of drifted into the background. And in our own modern times, fiction has become very political. And the sort of the problem with that is that ideas of the political, and many modern writers are operating in the belief that all our problems can be solved within society, that all our problems are within society. But the problems that I've just talked about, they're actually outside society. They cannot be addressed by society. They can only occur outside that, in a different space, whether it's religious, philosophical, spiritual approaches. And fiction's not been meeting that. Fiction's not been addressing it. And I think it's hugely important because the moment that we're in, these powers are operating very deep under the surface of modern society. They're there. I think there's a religious problem now within modern society that can no longer be answered by religion. And it's operating very deep under society, and we're not aware of it, but it's there, and I don't see writers dealing with it. And that's what Beyond the Sea is about.
And while this boat is going around in this sort of existential void, there's lots of rubbish coming past because they are actually connected. They're getting all these plastic bags and things.
You go back to Wordsworth and you go back to the Romantics, and they went for a walk into nature, and nature was the great mirror. You stared at nature and its cleansing beauty, and you saw your own soul. And so now in our modern time, well, that's just not possible anymore. And so our two men are adrift in the Pacific Ocean, and all they're meeting is just the detritus of society globbing together on the ocean. And that's what actually keeps them alive for as long as whichever of them is alive. That they're actually finding what they need through the refuge. They're finding bits of fishing nets, they're finding bits of plastic, they're finding all styrofoam for comfort. All the things you need can be found in the ocean. And at one point, it's been a while since I've read the book, but Bolivar makes a joke that we have everything we want here.
Yes, I do recommend it. I'm going to just open it up to questions in a minute. I think there might be a mic. Is there a mic going to go around? But I just want to ask you, so do you feel this is the novel, Prophet Song is the novel that has got the Booker, it's made you into an international star. How do you feel about that? Do you feel defensive of your other novels?
There's an adjustment. I mean, it's interesting because, I feel my other books were just as good, but it takes a certain kind of alignment, perhaps, of topic, moment, luck, who's on a jury. There's a lot of luck that goes into at least longlisting or shortlisting, but to win it, well, that's in the lap of the gods. And it's been interesting because it has completely changed my life. There's no doubt about it, and it's changed it forever. Because once you win the Booker, that's it. You've been sort of knighted, and when you die, it'll be Booker Prize winner Paul Lynch, and that's how it is. But it's also strange in all sorts of weird ways. So I was in Australia and New Zealand very recently, 2 weeks ago, and I got a text message from my friend, the Irish writer Donald Ryan, and it just said, "What the fuck is going on down there?" And he had a photograph of a news story that had come from the Sydney Morning Herald, and the headline read, "The day I went shopping for hair products with the Booker Prize winner." And I thought, I'm a serious man, I'm a serious writer. How do I even begin to explain this one? And what had happened was, I had arrived in Sydney, I had a photo shoot with Sydney Morning Herald and an interview, and I realised I'd forgotten my frizzies. And I'd come out of the shower and I thought, fuck, I've no frizzies. So I said, I'll go get some frizzies. And as I'm leaving the hotel, the journalist is coming in the door. And she said, "Oh, Paul," I said, "I have to go to find a pharmacy. Do you know where I can find one?" And she said, "I'll show you." I said, "I need some frizzies." I said, "But you can come with me, but you cannot write about it." Journalists. And the next thing, it becomes an international incident.
Right, we've got one there. Two there. One there, and then one immediately behind you.
So, Paul, congratulations on an award-winning book. A lot of your peers look towards Hollywood. Is that what you intend for the book, or is there another trajectory that you have with this particular book?
Very good, succinct question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, I mean, Hollywood, the problem with Hollywood is it very often, in my opinion, doesn't make what I call thinking, feeling, grown-up cinema. And I write fiction that I think is thinking, feeling, grown-up literature. And so I would like to see it translate in a similar kind of way. And for a book like this to go to Hollywood, it would be filleted in a way that they just filled it down to some sort of functional thriller with a bit of colour, but it would lose the layers that I think this book has. And so, there may be stuff in the works, and it won't be the Hollywood direction.
A Bollywood.
Peut-être, perhaps. Who knows?
Open to offers. Yes. Oh, sorry, hi, yeah.
Hi. You spoke about fiction, and both in terms of it being able to tell a story, but also in terms of the problems we're having now with fiction in terms of philosophical issues or being limited to modern society. What would be your views on fantasy in telling those stories? Because often you see fantasy as being the best examples of where you've had political commentary or commentaries about religion or existentialism.
I've never been a great reader of fantasy personally. It just doesn't appeal to whatever way my brain is wired. I remember when I was about, I think 12, I read what's the book that precedes the Lord of the Rings.
The Hobbit.
No.
The Silmarillion. No, that's much later.
There's a book and I read it and I just thought, gosh, I really can't. But good writing, when it's really good, will always supersede genre, will always move past genre. Like genre writing can be great. The problem with genre writing is that it very often sticks to the format, it sticks to readers' expectations. It very often sticks to a binary understanding of the world. It has an idea of good and evil. But life's too complex for that. Life happens in the grey. You know, I think that fiction should be high resolution grey. But any writing that can move past those limitations and you know can speak to whatever the writer's preoccupations are. So I don't believe that it's just literary fiction can do that. Any form of writing can do it.
You were talking about how the story is told through small moments, but I think the thing with this book that struck me was that there are very few moments of lightness. Even as this lady looks at her baby, or it's just a constant, such a claustrophobic sense of dread that just grows through the book. So I was just wondering if you could kind of comment on that. I'm sure it's an intentional choice, but really leaves no room for it.
Well, I think that comic relief would seem out of place in this book. I think that when you're caught up in what she's caught up in, it consumes you. If your husband has been arrested and then swallowed by the state, your husband, your spouse, and there's no comeback. The judiciary are silenced. There's no comeback. Your lawyer walks away from the case because they're going to be arrested too. At which point, the known structures of the state are no longer operating the way they used to. That's going to consume you. And I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the way that how in life our trajectories can be altered and we can be robbed from the future that we thought we had. We've all met with these moments. The unwanted comes and it knocks on your door. And you just think, why me? Why now? Why is this happening to me? And then you become obsessed with it. Your marriage ends. It's all you can think about for a year. Your husband disappears. It's all you're going to think about. Your world is falling apart. It's all you can think about because that's the reality of it. And so there are moments of levity in the book, but she's dealing with teenagers, but they're traumatized by the fact that their father's missing, by the fact that the teacher at school is no longer the right teacher for the school because the school has been controlled by the state. That everything is beginning to sort of to slide in away from what was good and what was true, or at least what was known. And so these things consume you. And so it's important to reflect the truth of that and not try and make things cheery for the reader, not offer some false sense of resolution, not offer some false sense of truth. Truth is all you have as a storyteller. And the goal, I think, of serious fiction anyway is to be truthful and to meet that truth with an honesty that the reader will be gratified by. Because even though this book is very dark, I've never had anyone say, well, that was untrue. I felt that was completely untrue. Nobody's ever said that. And I think that when you look the Medusa in the eye, so to speak, when you take the reader into these places and you do so truthfully, the reader is actually, maybe empowered is the wrong word, but they feel that they've encountered something they needed to see. Whereas, other writers will avert their gaze. Other writers do look away. Other writers will stitch in the happy ending. But I think that's doing a huge disservice to what fiction should be doing.
You don't stitch in a happy ending, but you stitch in possibility.
Well, the ending's a question.
It's a question, exactly.
It's a question.
And that is what that's the generosity of it.
Yeah, serious fiction should ask questions, shouldn't provide answers. If you're writing to provide answers, then what's the point? You're just saying to the reader, this is how it is, this is how it should be. This is why I often say that political fiction is decidedly political is problematic, because it's arrived upon what it thinks is the truth. Life's too complex. And so the job is to open the reader out to the complexity, to the unknown, to the vastness of the unknown, and to ask questions. And I think that if you go back through time and you look at all the great fiction, it's almost always asking questions in one way or another.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating session, and thank you for being such a good audience with such good questions as well.
Thank you, Claire, for a lovely interview.